Jo has survived some of the most dangerous operations imaginable. She has sent soldiers into situations where the chances of coming home were almost non-existent. She has manipulated powerful targets, made impossible decisions, sacrificed people she cared about, and repeatedly carried the weight of those decisions without allowing herself to break. But now, the situation is different. For once, Jo is the one trapped. And that changes everything. The Season 3, Episode 5 trailer appears to set up a battle that isn't simply about whether Jo can physically escape Russian captivity. The much bigger question is whether she can escape without becoming part of the Russians' plan. Because the deeper we go into this storyline, the more suspicious everything becomes. Why does the enemy seem to know so much? Why is Jo still alive? Why does the Russian side appear to understand American intelligence behavior so well? And most importantly, what happens if Jo's captors aren't trying to stop her from escaping, but are actually waiting for her to make a specific move? That possibility could completely change the way we interpret Episode 5. So today, we're going deeper than the obvious trailer predictions. We're going to break down Jo's potential escape strategy, the Russian advantage, Alexandra's suspicious knowledge, Caitlyn's possible response, and the one theory that could explain why Jo's captivity may be much more important than it initially appears. One of the most fascinating things about Jo's situation is how much the power dynamic has changed. Normally, Jo enters an operation with information. She knows the target. She knows the environment. She knows what her team is supposed to accomplish. And even when things go wrong, she usually has some level of control. But captivity removes almost all of that. Jo doesn't know exactly what the enemy knows. She doesn't know how many people are involved. She doesn't know whether her location has already been compromised to other Russian assets. She doesn't know who is coming for her, and she doesn't know whether the Americans even know she's alive. That last point could become extremely important, because Jo's greatest advantage has always been communication. She can call people, she can send instructions, she can coordinate an extraction. But when she loses communication, she becomes dependent on her ability to improvise. And that is why I don't think Jo's escape will begin with violence. It will begin with observation. Jo is going to study everything. The guards, their routines, their personalities, their mistakes. The building, the doors, the cameras, the transportation, the moments when security becomes weaker. She will be looking for patterns, because Jo understands something that most people don't. A heavily guarded location isn't necessarily impossible to escape from. It is only predictable. And if the people guarding her become predictable, Jo can eventually exploit that. Here's one of the biggest possibilities I think Episode 5 could explore. Jo may deliberately make her captors believe they have defeated her. Think about psychology. If the Russians believe Jo is still fighting, they're going to remain cautious. But if they begin to believe that she is exhausted, isolated, frightened, or resigned to her situation, their behavior could change. They could become less careful. They could talk more openly around her. They could move her without the same level of security. They could allow certain people closer to her. And that is exactly what Jo needs. She doesn't necessarily need her captors to become stupid. She only needs them to become comfortable. That could be the first stage of her escape. Jo stops looking for the door. Instead, she starts looking for the person who can open it. And that person may not even realize what Jo is doing. Every intelligence operation has weaknesses. Even highly trained organizations depend on ordinary human beings. Someone gets tired. Someone becomes careless. Someone disagrees with an order. Someone wants money. Someone wants recognition. Someone wants revenge. And Jo is an expert at identifying those cracks. This is where her psychological training becomes more valuable than physical strength. She doesn't need to convince everyone. She only needs to influence one person. Imagine Jo discovering that one of her guards has a personal problem. Maybe that person has a family member. Maybe they're afraid of their superior. Maybe they resent the people running the operation. Maybe they're simply inexperienced. Jo could exploit that, not by openly asking for help. That would immediately raise suspicion. Instead, she could plant an idea, a doubt, a question, a piece of information, something that makes the guard start thinking independently. And once the guard starts making decisions independently, the security system becomes unpredictable. That is where Jo thrives. Now we get to the darker possibility. What if they know Jo would do exactly that? This is where Alexandra becomes so important. Because if Alexandra really understands the Lioness program and American intelligence methods to the degree we've been led to believe, then the Russians may already know how Joe thinks. They may know that she studies guards. They may know she manipulates people. They may know she looks for emotional weaknesses. They may know she prefers indirect solutions. And if they know all of that, they could build the prison around those weaknesses. That means every apparent opportunity Joe discovers could potentially be intentional. Every weak guard, every unlocked door, every strange conversation, every unexplained change in routine could be bait. And this creates one of the most dangerous situations Joe has ever faced. Because Joe has spent her career asking, what is the enemy hiding? Now she may have to ask, what does the enemy want me to find? That is a completely different problem. I keep coming back to Alexandra because there is something unusual about her role in this storyline. She isn't simply another character caught between the Americans and Russians. She appears to occupy a much more complicated position, and her knowledge raises questions that haven't been fully answered. How does she understand American operations so well? How does she recognize the significance of the Lioness program? How much information has actually reached the Russian side? And could someone within the American intelligence structure have indirectly exposed operational methods? I'm not saying there has to be a traditional mole. That theory is almost too obvious. There could be another explanation. The Russians may have spent years studying American behavior. They may have intercepted communications. They may have recruited sources. They may have analyzed previous Lioness operations. Or they could have someone with intimate knowledge of how the CIA thinks. And if that's the case, Joe isn't walking into a conventional enemy. She's walking into an enemy that has been studying the same playbook she uses. That makes her escape much more dangerous. This could be the real character challenge for Joe. She's spent so much of her career being the person who controls the situation, but now she can't. She can't simply call in a team. She can't order a strike. She can't rely on a heavily armed extraction crew. She may not even know where she is. So Joe has to become something different. Less commander, more survivor. And that could produce some of the most intense scenes of the season. Because Joe's greatest weakness may actually be her instinct to protect everyone else. She could find an opportunity to escape, but hesitate because someone else is in danger. She could discover information that might help her, but put another person at risk. She could have the chance to leave, but realize that doing so could expose her team. And that creates the ultimate Joe dilemma. Does she save herself, or does she protect the mission? Knowing Joe, she will probably try to do both. And that is exactly what could put her in even greater danger. While Joe is fighting to escape on the ground, Caitlyn could be fighting a completely different battle. Because if Joe disappears, someone has to figure out what happened. And the longer Joe remains missing, the more difficult the situation becomes. Caitlyn cannot simply send people everywhere. There are political consequences. There are operational consequences. And there is the possibility that the Russians are deliberately feeding the Americans false information. This could force Caitlyn into an uncomfortable position. She may have to question everything. Who is telling the truth? Who is compromised? Who has access to Joe's location? Who benefits from Joe being rescued? And perhaps most importantly, who wants the Americans to launch an operation? Because if the Russians have captured Joe, they know the Americans will eventually come looking. That means Joe could become the center of a much larger strategic game. This is one of my strongest predictions for the next episode. Suppose the Americans finally locate Joe. Suppose Caitlyn receives confirmation. Suppose an extraction team is assembled. Everything appears to be moving in the right direction. But what if the location is exactly where the Russians want them to go? That would be devastating. Because Joe's capture could then become a weapon against the CIA. The Russians wouldn't need to defeat the Americans directly. They would simply need to manipulate their response. They could control the information, control the timing, control the location, and force the Americans into making predictable decisions. That would turn Joe into more than a hostage. She would become bait. And if Joe realizes that before the rescue happens, she may deliberately sabotage her own extraction. Imagine that. Joe finally gets the opportunity she's been waiting for, and she refuses to take it. Not because she doesn't want freedom, but because she realizes the freedom being offered is part of the trap. That would be classic Lioness. There is another possibility that could completely change the story. What if Joe isn't the actual target? What if she is connected to the real target? Maybe the Russians don't simply want intelligence about the Lioness program. Maybe they want information about a specific American operation, a political figure, a military asset, a financial network, or someone connected to the 5 U.S. senators we've been watching. If Joe possesses information that connects these pieces together, then her value becomes enormous. And this could explain why she hasn't simply been eliminated. A dead Joe gives the Russians closure. A living Joe gives them leverage. And intelligence organizations almost always value leverage. That means the question isn't necessarily, why haven't they killed Joe? The more important question may be, what are they waiting for her to reveal? And this is where I think Joe could surprise everyone. If the Russians question her, Joe doesn't necessarily have to answer. She can ask questions too. She can watch their reactions. She can identify what they already know. And every question they ask tells her something. If they ask about a particular person, she knows that person matters. If they ask about a particular operation, she knows they're interested in it. If they already know certain details, she knows the information is compromised. So Joe could use the interrogation itself as intelligence gathering. The Russians think they're extracting information from her, but Joe may actually be extracting information from them. And that could give her the missing piece she needs to escape. There's another emotional element that shouldn't be overlooked. Joe has always been extremely controlled. Even when she is devastated, she tries to keep moving. But captivity is different. You can't control time. You can't control who enters the room. You can't control what happens to your team. And you can't control whether anyone is coming for you. That psychological pressure could force Joe into a decision she normally wouldn't make. A reckless decision. A desperate decision. And ironically, that could be what saves her. Because the enemy may have studied the strategic Joe. They may have studied the commander. They may have studied the CIA officer. But what happens when Joe stops behaving predictably? What happens when she abandons the plan? What happens when she takes a risk that nobody expects? That may be her greatest advantage. I also think we should consider something important. Joe doesn't necessarily need to run out of the building. Her escape could happen through transportation. She could be moved. She could exploit a transfer. She could create confusion between multiple Russian groups. She could manipulate someone into moving her somewhere less secure. Or she could escape during a moment when the Russians believe they're actually increasing security. That's why I wouldn't focus only on the obvious physical prison. The real opportunity could come when Joe is moved from one location to another. Transfers create chaos. Different personnel become involved. Information gets passed between people. Vehicles move. Communication increases. And every transition creates a vulnerability. If Joe is going to make her move, that could be the moment. Now let's go even further. What if Joe does escape, but the person who finds her isn't American? This would be a massive twist. Imagine Joe escaping into an unfamiliar area, injured and exhausted, expecting an American extraction. Instead, someone else finds her, someone who claims to be helping, but Joe doesn't know whether that person is actually there to save her. That would force Joe into another psychological battle. Does she trust them? Does she run? Does she fight? Does she follow them? And if that person has information about the Russians, Joe could suddenly realize that her captivity was only one layer of a much larger operation. This could also connect back to Alexandra. Because if Alexandra's loyalties aren't as straightforward as they appear, she could potentially become connected to Joe's escape in a way nobody expects. Another theory worth watching is that the Russian side may not be completely united. We often talk about the Russians as if they're one organization. But intelligence operations rarely work that cleanly. Different people have different objectives. One person might want Joe dead. Another might want information. Another might want to use her politically. Another might want to trade her. Another might want to exploit her capture for strategic leverage. If those objectives collide, Joe suddenly has an opening. Because she can manipulate division. She doesn't have to defeat everyone. She can encourage them to fight each other. And Joe is extremely good at finding disagreements and turning them into opportunities. But I don't think the writers will make Joe's escape easy. If she gets out, there needs to be a consequence. Maybe she is injured. Maybe someone dies helping her. Maybe she loses critical information. Maybe she discovers that her team has already been compromised. Or maybe she escapes but realizes she has left someone behind. That final possibility could be especially painful for Jo. Because Jo has always carried responsibility for her people. If she gets out while someone else remains trapped, she may refuse to simply walk away, and that could lead to another dangerous decision. She escapes, then turns around, not because she has to, because she refuses to leave someone behind. That could set up the next major confrontation. Now here's where I think the episode could deliver its biggest twist. Jo finally finds a way out. She gets access to communication. She manages to contact the Americans. Everyone thinks the nightmare is ending, but Jo gives them one warning. She tells them, "Don't come for me," and everyone on the other side is confused. Why would Jo tell them not to rescue her? Because she has realized something. The Russians aren't simply holding her. They're waiting for the Americans to come, waiting for the CIA to expose its response, waiting for someone to reveal themselves. And Jo has just discovered that her captivity may be part of a much larger intelligence operation. Then the episode cuts away, and we see someone on the American side receiving information that should have been impossible for the Russians to know. That would immediately raise one terrifying possibility. Someone on the inside is feeding information out. And suddenly, Jo's escape isn't the biggest mystery anymore. The bigger mystery becomes, who is betraying the operation? This is ultimately what makes episode 5 so exciting. I don't think the biggest story is simply whether Jo survives. She's Jo. Of course she's going to fight. The real story is what happens after she gets the opportunity to escape. Because if the Russians have studied her, anticipated her behavior, and potentially manipulated the American response, then Jo could walk directly from one trap into another. And there is one possibility that could make everything even more dangerous. What if Jo escapes with information that she doesn't realize is valuable? What if the Russians intentionally allow her to see something? What if they want her to report it? What if the information she carries back to Caitlyn is exactly what they need the CIA to believe? Then Jo could become an unwitting messenger, and that would be devastating. Because Jo's entire career has been built around controlling information. Now, for the first time, she could be the person unknowingly carrying someone else's message. That is why I don't think we should simply ask, will Jo escape? I think the better question is, will Jo know whether her escape was real? Because if the Russians planned her escape from the beginning, then the moment Jo thinks she has finally won could actually be the moment she loses. And that brings us to the biggest prediction for episode 5. I believe Jo will find a way to fight back. I believe she will identify a weakness. I believe she will create an opportunity to escape. But I don't think she will walk away untouched. Something will follow her. Information, a clue, a betrayal, or possibly someone she thought she could trust. And if the episode ends with Jo looking directly at Caitlyn and saying that the Russians knew too much, then we may finally get the confirmation that this entire operation has been compromised from much closer to home than anyone expected. So now I want to hear your theory. Do you think Jo will actually escape in episode 5? Or do you think the Russians are deliberately allowing her to escape because they want her to lead them somewhere? And what about Alexandra? Is she simply an important Russian connection, or does she know something about the Lioness program that could expose a much bigger betrayal? Because if Jo survives this, she may not return to the Lioness operation as the same person. She may come back with information that changes everything. And the most dangerous thing Jo could discover isn't that the Russians know her methods. It's that someone taught them. If you want more Lioness Season 3 theories, trailer breakdowns, hidden clues, and predictions, make sure you subscribe. Because episode 5 may not just be about Jo escaping captivity. It could be the episode that finally reveals who has been playing whom all along.